Welcome to another video, this time featuring our upcoming auction number 29. This auction with 72 lots will be closing Friday night. For those who have not checked out these auctions, please check our video tutorial. Let's go through the various lots to be found on auction 29. You can scroll through each lot, or you can simply enter a title into the search bar found at the top of the page. Mysterious Wu Fang, February 1936. Popular Publications attempt to clone Fu Manchu, a wonderful cover by Jerome Rosen, the twin brother of the Shadows cover artist George Rosen. Saucy Romantic Adventures, June 1936. From the publisher of Saucy Movie Tales, Saucy Romantic Adventures features spicy historical fiction tales with mostly unknown authors. The cover is by one of the true pulp artist legends, Norman Saunders. These issues are possibly scarcer than the Saucy Movie Tales. Saucy Movie Tales, November 1936. Speaking about Saucy Movie, another Good Girl art cover by Norman Saunders, although he used his mother's maiden name Blaine for credit on a lot of these. Murder Stories, July/August 1931. Published by Harold Hersey, this copy was one of the original copies sent to the Library of Congress for copyright purposes. Several decades ago, these sample copies were sold by the LOC. Mystery Adventures, December 1936. This title saw a number of changes in its short life. The title bounced from publisher to publisher. Well, each publisher would make changes to the title, but essentially this is the same magazine and super scarce to boot. This issue features an author, Patrick Casey, who with his brother would write some rip-snorting adventures for a number of adventure fiction magazines in their day. Lovers Magazine, October 1933. Well, this is a scarce copy of the first issue of Lovers Magazine by Popular Publications. This title would see a scant 5 total issues published in its day. Detective Tales, April 1939. Detective Tales was produced as a companion magazine to Popular's best-selling title, Dime Detective. This issue features some great pulp authors, including Richard Sale, Fred McIsaac, and Arden X. Pangborn. Detective Story Magazine, October 5th, 1916. An early issue with the best-selling author Sax Rohmer being featured. The Yellow Claw was another Asian villain, a common trope in the literature of the day. Mystery Stories, October 1928. A high-grade magazine from this scarce series published by the Priscilla Company. Mystery Stories tried to broaden their audience by appealing to readers of multiple genres like Western and adventure. All Detective Magazine, January 1935. The cover for this issue is perhaps one of the most iconic covers of all time. Another great Norman Saunders cover. Our damsel in distress is chained to a large plate held up by a number of unseen assistants and soon to be attacked by a very snake-like character bearing twin fang-like knives. Explorers, September 1929. Published by Dell Magazines, this first and only issue is one of the scarcest magazines to be found. I've only seen one other copy of this title. Street and Smith Sampler from 1931. Speaking of scarce, here is a Street and Smith only edition of what was simply an advertising title featuring several new magazines coming out in 1931, including a backup story from The Shadow magazine. Very possibly you can count the number of copies out there on a single hand. Private Detective Stories, November 1937. An incredibly high-grade, spicy pulp. Actually, this was more mainstream than their companions titled Spicy Detective Stories. This cover is by one of their most dependable artists, H.J. Ward. The paper on this issue is nearly as white as it was when first published. Private Detective, August 1937. As previously mentioned, Private Detective had less sex and much less racier covers than was featured in Spicy Detective. Hard to believe that this is the same publisher of Superman, Batman, and, well, they had skin magazines as well. Terror Tales, July-August 1938. The sex and sadism these weird menace pulps featured had started to cool. Not that you could see that from this cover by John Drew. This is a truly remarkable high-grade copy. 10 Detective Aces, July 1938. When Harold Hersey was dismissed from his own line of magazines, 10 Detective Aces was originally Detective Dragnet. The new executive editor, A.A. Wynn, changed the title and introduced a plethora of characters, one of which was Captain Murdoch by Carl McKay Saunders. Another was a strange hero by the name of the Moon Man. The Feds, October 1936. When this Street and Smith title was being introduced, the genre of the gang pulp was fading. J. Edgar Hoover was being lionized with a whole group of valorous government men, or G-men. The Feds only lasted a couple of years and ceased in December of 1937. Spicy Detective Stories, May 1935. The next 4 lots are from the aptly titled Trojan publications. Sold mostly under the counter or with the cover art obscured, these magazines had a 25-cent cover price, much higher than the standard price of 10 to 15 cents. These magazines span the gamut of mainstream genres like adventure, weird menace, western, and detective. Each issue of Spicy Detective included Dan Turner, Hollywood Detective, by Robert Leslie Bellum. Bellum's prose was filled with colorful descriptions of violent action. Spicy Adventure Stories, October 1941. This title would include space and seafaring adventurers. Of course, they all had their damsels in various forms of undress and action that would have been called softcore porn in the day. Covers by one of their main artists employed by Trojan, Howard Parkhurst. Spicy Adventures, June 1937. African natives was not a scarce cover subject. Of course, their depiction would always be highly racist, and this Ward cover is no different. Spicy Adventures, 6 of 35. This early issue of Spicy Adventure includes another dark-skinned native, but this time with an Asian theme. Spicy's tintillated the readers of its day, and it's heavily sought out by current collectors. Fight Stories, March 1932. For those Robert E. Howard fans, copies of the Fiction House titles has always been a hard get. Fight and action stories from the early 30s was a bitch to acquire. Although in lower grade, this issue is one of those hard-to-find copies with a Howard story and a cover story to boot. Speed Adventure Stories, July 1943. When the social and local censors finally got to Trojan, they changed their main spicy titles and renamed them to Speed. Now, instead of Spicy Adventure, we have Speed Adventure Stories. The covers were less sexy and the stories were stripped of their overt sexual plots. This still has the spicy cover master H.J. Ward's work adorning it. Detective Story Magazine, April 25, 1931. For nearly 2 decades, John A. Coughlin art graced a weekly issue of Detective Story Magazine. This issue has one of his best, as well as the promotional logo for the radio show Street and Smith sponsored. Their narrator, who started these shows, was simply known as the Shadow. And when listeners started to show up to their newsstands looking and asking for the Shadow, the publishers didn't wait to jump on the bandwagon and produce it. Hence, the Shadow was born in March 1931. Top Notch, July 1935. Robert E. Howard's best paydays was with Street and Smith, and here his cover story, The Blood of the Gods, was featured in this 1935 issue. Weird Tales, for whom he wrote most of his stories, for was always a very slow-paying outlet. In fact, Howard would beg the editor, Farnsworth Wright, at times to pay up. Street and Smith was a much different publisher and paid upon acceptance, and I'll guess at a higher rate as well. Alas, Howard would take his own life in 1936, cutting short his brief career. Double Detective, March 1943. Double Detective was originally published by the publisher of Argosy, Munsey. In 1943, Popular Publications bought most of Munsey's titles, including Double Detective and its title character, the Green Llama. In this one, and only issue Popular produced, the Green Llama, who would go on to star in movie serials and a radio series, starred in The Case of the Beardless Corpse. Dime Mystery Magazine, July 1938. Dime Mystery was the initial Weird Menace title, introduced in 1932 as a companion title to Dime Detective. For nearly a year, Dime Mystery would be known as Dime Mystery Book Magazine. The title would be simplified to Dime Mystery Magazine and bears the first sex and sadism issues, Weird Menace stories, late in 1933. This fantastic issue is nearly flawless and features the typical bondage and sadistic cover theme. Spicy Mystery Stories, January 1936. Never subtle, this issue features a Parkhurst cover, and perhaps one of his best, as Trojan was really ramping up the sex in the Weird Menace genre of titles. It also doesn't hurt that this copy is well above average grade. Spicy Detective Stories, April 1942. This issue was toward the end of the Spicy line, with a retitled The Speed Detective just around the corner. Well, these still featured Dan Turner by Robert Leslie Bellum. This issue is another above average graded copy. Spicy Detective Stories, July 1936. Another really nice word cover and featuring several stories by Bellum, both under his own name and one of his many pseudonyms, Ellery Watson Calder. Pretty much easy to spot Bellum from the contents page, as his use of 3 named pseudonyms hid the true author's name and was sprinkled throughout the 4 Spicy titles. Tattletales, September 1936. Long before Playboy, titles like the following 2 lots would include some fiction and a smattering of semi-nude photographs. Most of these issues were saddle-stitched and only had around 64 pages. Now known as girly pulps, these softcore porn titles featured cheesecake pinup females in various poses with and without clothing. La Paris Stories, April 1935. For whatever reason you'd like to imagine, these magazines rarely show in high grade. This is one of those scarce high-grade copies. It also has a wonderful cover by Earl K. Berge, who is also known for his covers for a number of pulp and paperback books. Spicy Detective Stories, August 1937. An excellent high-grade copy of this Spicy Detective. A very nice Parkhurst cover. Norval Page also appears in this edition, although under the name of N. Wooten Poge. Spicy Detective Stories, January 1941. A different Mile High Club, and we thought current flight attendants had it rough. Spicy Adventure Stories, December 1938. An above average copy of this Oriental Mantis edition. Spicy Adventure Stories, May 1940. A near flawless copy of this wartime issue. Did they sink the ship just to get that woman? Gay Parisienne, June 1935. Although the publisher is stated as D.M. Publishing, or DM Publishing, it's the same as Culture or Trojan, or a myriad of other company names which will be the same as DC Comics. Paris Nights, September 1933. The artist on this cover of this high-grade beauty was Jack Grenier. He worked almost exclusively for the girly magazines and later on left to do portraits. Scarlet Confessions, December 1936. This isn't strictly a pulp magazine, as it's near the size of a bedsheet-sized issue of like Amazing Stories. It's part of the subgenre of magazines known as true romance or confession titles, nevertheless exceedingly scarce. Movie Humor, May 1936. This is a very large bedsheet, staple-bound girly magazine filled with cartoons, pictures, and some fiction. Disregard the size listed on the auction site. This is larger than any standard pulp bedsheet and very scarce. Stolen Sweets, June 1936. Stolen Sweets changed format sizes almost as often as one would change their underwear. This staple-bound girly pulp is slightly smaller than a standard bedsheet pulp. Prize Detective Magazine, November 1929. Another example of a Library of Congress copy. This title only lasted a scant 4 issues, along with an equally scarce titles of Prize Air Pilot and Prize Story Magazine. This might be the best conditioned copy you'd ever find. Personal Adventure, December 1937. One of only 3 editions published, this is an unknown issue that is one of the authors, meaning me, of the Adventure House Guide to the Pulps. I could never locate any information about this particular issue. Super Detective Stories, May 1935. This is one of the scarce bedsheets early issues of Super Detective Stories. Although it outwardly appears to be part of the Spicy line of magazines, this is actually a co-production of Ralph Armour, previously the publisher of Raymer Review magazines, of like Zeppelin stories. The format changed from bedsheet to pulp-sized and then canceled midway through 1935. Later, Harry Donenfeld resurrected it in 1940. New York Stories, August 1936. The Hot Cha Gal. Need we say more? Bedtime Stories, May 1938. An above-average copy with a Peter Dribbin cover, another artist who specialized in the good girl art covers. Pep Stories, May 1929. Closer to a real pulp than the 64-page saddle-stitched girly pulps that would follow. Much more fiction than art, images, and includes the Spicy line of magazines author Robert Leslie Bellum. Argosy, August 15, 1936. A real high-grade copy with a Robert E. Howard story to boot. In fact, this is Howard's first story of 5 within the pages of Argosy. Gangster Stories, June 1931. One of the gang magazines published by Harold Hersey. Hersey, over his several publishing concerns, was known to purchase the cheapest paper he could find to cut costs, which mean you rarely see these pulps without tan pages. This has off-white paper, actually a real find. Ghost Stories, May 1931. Ghost Stories was originally published by Bernard McFadden, who is better known for his series of true magazines. Nearly all of his titles were bedsheet publications, and a few pulp-sized magazines were then moved to Hersey's Good Story line of pulps. Horror Stories, November 1935. Part of the original series of Weird Menace magazines that publisher Harry Steger pioneered in 1933, Steger said his inspiration was the Guignol Theater in Paris, a theater that had live scenes of gruesome and sadistic horror and mutilations. Although this could well be the true inspiration, Steger was known for creating a newsstand in his office and trying to best see what worked and made his magazine stand out. Selling magazines during the Depression meant heavy competition for those dimes that readers had to scrape together. Leading Western, April 1945. A first issue and a Library Congress copy to boot. Harry Donenfeld was heavy into comics at this time, but the cost of producing four-color comics was one of the reasons pulp/comic publishers continued to produce pulps. Although selling fewer copies, pulp magazines were cheap, and Donenfeld started to branch out into more mainstream titles and subjects. Outlaws of the West, April 1932. Another Hersey magazine that is in fine condition. Paper isn't quite near white, and there are some light creases to the cover. One of his 18 issues published. This title is extremely difficult to find. Cowboy Stories, July 1937. The only saving grace to this Robert E. Howard story, although this story was published after Howard's suicide. Fight Stories, March 1930. Robert E. Howard was known to shadowbox down the streets of Cross Plains, Texas, his hometown. One could say that Howard either imagined himself to be Conan or, more to the point, Sailor Steve Costigan, his boxing hero. Pep, December 1926. A semi-nude photographic cover, and of course it's listed as an art magazine. This is the first issue of this series that lasted over half a decade. Spicy Western Stories, January 1938. Instead of hunchback monsters threatening our damsel, it's a pack of howling wolves. Spicy Western, December 1942. The last issue of the run, as the title would be retitled as Speed Western. Spicy Western, August 1941. Bondage, guns, and bad men. What else do you need in this ward cover? Wings, summer 1948. Post-World War II issue with an excellent Norman Saunders. Of course, can't say that this would be a truly historic event. Dime Detective Magazine, March 1937. Blurring the line between Weird Menace and detective fiction, Dime Detective still had some of the best authors who did indeed write for the horror magazines. The disembodied head is quite the topper to this Malvin Singer painted cover. Detective Action Stories, December 1936. This title was one of the original 4 magazines Steger published to start Popular Publications. The magazine was canceled in April 1932 and 4 years later was reintroduced at a lower price as another companion to Dime Detective. The Popular Magazine, December 7, 1930. Street and Smith had a number of general fiction and adventure titles. Magazines like Top Notch, All Around Magazine, News Story Magazine, People's, and Wide Awake Magazine. Published everything from Western pioneers to Tarzan. It was within the pages of Popular that science fiction-styled stories would creep in, such as Men from Space. Spicy Adventure Stories, May 1936. Our hero is trying to save his paramour from the evil clutches of what appears to be a 1930s version of a pirate. After all, our hero is dressed in more modern clothing and clutching a revolver. Action Stories, December 1935. Robert E. Howard's name graces the cover of this damaged copy of Action Stories. Howard was popular among a wide range of readers, but outside of Weird Tales, his name didn't make it to the front cover too often. Snappy Stories, January 20, 1926. Although this might look like a tried-and-true girly pulp, it's much more of a pulp with some fairly racy romance stories and an interesting cover art. Enoch Bowles, perhaps the best of the pinup artists, gives us his Christmas-themed cover. Spicy Mystery Stories, April 1938. What readers must have thought of medical professionals when they saw Weird Menace cover after cover with malevolent doctors experimenting on his subjects like a Dr. Josef Mengele. Liberty, December 23rd, 1933. Not a pulp at all, but one of the more popular magazines sold to a wider audience than its pulp brethren. This just so happens to include a part of a Tarzan serial by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Spicy Stories, January 1934. Another imaginative Earl K. Berge cover for this Donnenfeld publication. Amazing Stories, June 1927. Hugo Gernsback is credited with the first use of the phrase science fiction, and it was with Amazing Stories that he would publish both new and reprint fiction. The H.G. Wells story came from a British magazine in 1896. The A.A. Mayrd story was serialized and reprinted from his book published in 1919. The rest was mostly unknown authors, topped off with a Frank R. Paul cover. Speed Mystery, February 1943. This copy is the second issue. One Spicy Mystery was retitled a Speed Mystery, featuring a Hugh B. Cave story, writing as Just in Case. Yeah, pun intended. In an Alan Anderson cover. Anderson pretty much split his time painting covers for Fiction House and Donnenfeld's magazines. And lastly, we have Gold Seal Detective, June 1936. This title was published by magazine publishers whose original editor was Harold Hersey. The gang titles had lost their luster, and A.A. Wynn rushed to fill the void with Gold Seal Detective. It wasn't very successful and folded after less than a year and 6 issues. Thanks for previewing our Auction 20, which will have a rolling close starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Friday the 19th of November. Each lot will close in turn 2 minutes after the preceding lot. If you'd like this video, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, as we will be posting these auction previews as well as more pulp-related content in the future.